The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn leather of her boots and the thin wool of her tunic, sinking deep into her bones. Alara's fingers were raw, the skin split and bleeding from the harsh lye soap and the endless scrubbing of stone floors that were never truly clean. She was a ghost in this place, a shadow flitting through the great halls of the Silver Moon Pack House. They called her Omega, worthless, an unfortunate remnant of parents who had been shamed and cast out, leaving her behind as a debt to be worked off, a debt that, it seemed, would never be paid in full. Her stomach was a hollow ache, a familiar emptiness that gnawed at her day and night. Sometimes the cooks would toss her a stale crust of bread. Most times, they forgot she existed. Invisibility was both a curse and a shield. It kept her from notice, but it also starved her. A bucket of icy water sloshed over the floor, splashing up her legs and soaking the hem of her threadbare dress. The shock of it was like 1,000 needles. "Watch where you are, filth!" Lyra sneered. She stood over Alara, hands on her hips, her own fine wool dress pristine. Lyra was the Pack Alpha's daughter, beautiful and cruel, and she had made Alara her personal project since they were children. Alara gritted her teeth, the taste of blood filling her mouth as she bit the inside of her cheek. She would not cry. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. She simply bowed her head, her wet hair falling over her face to hide the flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Did you hear me, Omega?" Lyra's boot nudged Alara's ribs, not hard enough to break anything, but enough to send a jolt of pain through her. "Look at me when I speak to you." Slowly, Alara lifted her head. She met Lyra's cold blue eyes and kept her own expression a perfect, unnerving blank. The effort was immense. It felt like holding back a tidal wave of grief and rage that had been building inside her for years. "Yes, Lyra," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse from disuse. Lyra's lip curled in disgust. "Pathetic. Father is sending the tribute party to the Winterfang border tomorrow. You're going with them." A knot of ice formed in Alara's stomach, colder than the water on her skin. The borderlands were a wild, dangerous place, especially with winter closing in. It was a journey for seasoned warriors. "You can carry their supplies," Lyra continued with a malicious smile. "A strong back is the only thing you're good for. Maybe a frost cat will find you. It would be a mercy." She turned and stalked away, her laughter echoing down the cold stone corridor. Alara remained on her knees, shivering in the spreading puddle. A mercy. The thought was a dark, tempting whisper. But another, fiercer thought rose to meet it. No, she would not break. She would survive this, just as she had survived everything else. She pushed herself up, her aching muscles protesting. She picked up the bucket and the scrub brush. Her hands burned, her body ached, but her spirit, though battered and bruised, remained stubbornly, inexplicably whole. She would go, and she would come back. The journey was worse than she had imagined. The wind sliced like claws, relentless and cruel. Alara was burdened with a heavy pack, its straps digging into her shoulders until the flesh was raw. The warriors of the tribute party ignored her, speaking over and around her as if she were a piece of luggage. She trudged behind them, her head down, focusing on placing one frozen foot in front of the other. The landscape grew harsher, the pines heavy with snow, the sky a permanent bruised gray. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of ice and impending storms. The blizzard hit on the third day. It came without warning, a swirling vortex of white that blotted out the sun and the path. The world dissolved into a howling chaos of wind and snow. Shouts were swallowed by the gale. In seconds, the warrior in front of her was nothing but a faint shape, and then he was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's exhaustion. "Wait!" she cried, but the wind tore the word from her lips. She stumbled forward, blind, her arms held out in front of her. The weight of the pack threw her off balance. She was alone, completely and utterly alone in the heart of a raging storm. Her hope began to freeze, turning brittle in her chest. She did not know how long she walked. Time lost all meaning, measured only in the agonizing burn of her lungs and the growing numbness in her limbs. She was so cold, colder than she had ever been. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a dangerous, heavy lethargy. Her foot caught on an unseen root, and she pitched forward. The pack drove her down, and she landed hard, but the ground beneath her gave way with a sickening crack. For a heart-stopping second, she was suspended. Then, the ice shattered completely. The water was a shock so profound it stole the air from her lungs. It was black, suffocating, and impossibly cold. The weight of her pack dragged her down like a stone, pulling her into the crushing dark beneath the ice. Her mind screamed, but no sound came out. This was it. This was the mercy Lyra had spoken of. Her limbs were leaden. The struggle was already leaving her. Pinpricks of light danced behind her eyelids. The darkness was almost peaceful. It was an end to the cold, an end to the hunger, an end to the pain. She let her eyes drift closed. Then, something broke the surface above, a disturbance. A shape darker than the churning water. Strong arms encircled her waist, impossibly warm against her frozen skin. They hauled her upward, breaking through the jagged hole in the ice and dragging her onto the frozen riverbank. She was laid on the snow, coughing and sputtering, black water pouring from her lungs. She was too weak to move, too cold to feel. She could only lie there, a half-drowned thing on the edge of the world. A figure loomed over her, a mountain of a man cloaked in dark furs. Snow clung to his broad shoulders and tangled in his long black hair. He knelt, pushing back the hood of his cloak. Her vision was blurry, but she could make out a face carved from harsh lines and predatory beauty. It was a face of ancient power, of unforgiving winters and absolute command. And his eyes. They were the color of amber, and they seemed to glow with their own internal light. He reached for her, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed the wet, frozen hair from her face. The moment his skin touched hers, the world erupted. It was not a sound or a light, but both, and neither. It was a searing, white-hot agony that shot up her arm and exploded behind her eyes. A scream was ripped from her throat. On the back of her wrist, where his fingers had brushed her skin, a symbol burned itself into her flesh. It was a swirling, intricate knot of silver and gold light, a brand of impossible magic. The pain was blinding, overwhelming. She arched her back, writhing in the snow as the power of it coursed through her, a river of fire in her veins. It felt like being torn apart and remade all at once. Through the haze of her agony, she saw the man's eyes widen. The amber bled away, replaced by the incandescent glow of molten gold. He stared at the glowing mark on her wrist, then at her face, and a look of stunned, profound recognition crossed his features. He leaned closer, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that seemed to vibrate in her very soul. You. The word was not a question. It was a statement, a claim. Her terror was absolute. What was happening? Who was this man? Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of abuse, screamed at her to run, to hide. But her body, her very essence, betrayed her. It leaned into his presence, craving the impossible heat that radiated from him, a moth drawn to a star. He saw the fear in her eyes. His expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing into something less severe. He shrugged off his heavy, fur-lined cloak and wrapped it around her shivering form. The scent of pine, wood smoke, and something else, something wild and uniquely his, enveloped her. "I have you," he murmured, the words a solemn vow. He scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The world tilted, her head falling against the solid wall of his chest. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her completely was the golden fire of his eyes, burning with an intensity that promised both salvation and ruin. She was falling, and this time, she was not sure she would ever land. She awoke to warmth. It was the first thing she registered, a deep, penetrating heat that soaked into her chilled bones and thawed the ice in her veins. She was lying in a bed, a real bed, piled high with furs that were softer than anything she had ever touched. A massive fire roared in a stone hearth nearby, casting dancing shadows across the high, timbered ceiling. The room was vast, a chamber fit for a king. The walls were dark stone, hung with heavy tapestries depicting scenes of winter hunts and great white wolves running under a full moon. It was a place of stark, untamed power. Panic fluttered in her chest. Where was she? Who had brought her here? The memories returned in a flood. The blizzard, the ice, the drowning dark, and the man. The man with eyes of molten gold and a voice like thunder. The searing pain on her wrist. Alara's gaze darted to her arm. The glowing mark was still there, no longer burning but a permanent, intricate pattern of silver and gold woven into her skin. It was beautiful and terrifying. A brand, a claim. A floorboard creaked. She flinched, pulling the furs up to her chin. He stood near the fire, his back to her. The man from the storm. He was even larger than she remembered, his shoulders broad enough to block out most of the hearth's light. He wore simple black trousers and a tunic, the clothes of a warrior at rest, yet he radiated an aura of absolute authority. He turned, as if sensing she was awake. His amber eyes met hers across the room. There was no fire in them now, just a calm, watchful intensity. He held a wooden bowl that steamed with the rich scent of stew. "You are awake," he said. It was not a question. She could only nod, her throat tight with fear. He walked toward the bed. Every step was deliberate, powerful. Alara shrank back, pressing herself against the carved headboard. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Men who looked at her with such intensity always wanted something, and what they wanted was always taken by force. He stopped a few feet from the bed, his gaze unwavering. "You need to eat." He held out the bowl. She stared at it, then at him. Was it a trick? Was it poisoned? Her mind, conditioned by years of cruelty, could not process simple kindness. He seemed to read the suspicion in her eyes. A flicker of something, sadness perhaps, crossed his face. He set the bowl down on a small table near the bed, well within her reach but a safe distance from him. "I am Kaelin," he said, his voice softer now. "This is Winterfang Keep. You are safe here." Kaelin. The name echoed in the whispers she had heard from the Silver Moon warriors. The Alpha King, the supreme leader of the Winterfang Dominion, the most powerful shifter on the continent. A ruthless, ancient being who ruled the frozen north. And she was in his private chambers. The fear became a cold, sharp blade in her gut. What did a king want with a worthless Omega? The mark on her wrist seemed to pulse with a faint warmth. The answer was there, but she was too terrified to understand it. What do you want from me?" she whispered, the words barely audible. His expression was unreadable. "For now? For you to eat? To rest? To heal?" He watched her for a long moment, then turned and walked back to the chair by the fire, leaving her alone with the steaming stew and her suffocating fear. She waited until his back was turned before snatching the bowl. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The stew was rich with meat and vegetables, and the first taste was so overwhelmingly good it brought tears to her eyes. She devoured it like a starving animal, not caring how she looked. When she was done, she set the empty bowl aside and huddled back under the furs. She watched him. He did not move, simply sat staring into the flames, a solitary, powerful figure lost in thoughts she could not begin to guess. Night fell. The fire burned low, and the shadows in the room grew long and deep. Kalen rose from his chair. He moved toward the bed. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Her entire body went rigid. This was it. This was the moment the kindness would end. The moment the debt would be called due. The bed was enormous, easily big enough for two. He saw the sheer terror on her face, the way she pressed herself into the headboard as if she could melt through the wood. He stopped. His hands, which had been reaching to pull back the furs on the other side of the bed, clenched into fists at his sides. "No," she breathed, the word a desperate plea. "Please." A storm of emotions warred in his golden eyes, frustration, pain, and a deep, aching loneliness. But when he spoke, his voice was level, controlled. "I will not harm you," he said. She shook her head, tears finally tracking paths down her cheeks. "That's what they all say." The words hung in the air between them, an indictment of her entire life. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and seemed to understand. He saw the years of abuse, the ingrained terror that no amount of soft furs or warm stew could erase in a single day. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Without another word, he turned away from the bed. He walked to a large chest at the foot of it, took out a thick stack of furs and blankets, and carried them to the floor beside her bed. Alara watched, her confusion overriding her fear. What was he doing? He laid the furs on the cold stone floor, creating a makeshift pallet. Then, he lay down on it, his massive frame barely fitting. He pulled a single blanket over himself and turned his back to her, facing the door as if standing guard. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the dying embers in the hearth. Alara stared at the powerful shape of the Alpha King sleeping on the floor beside her bed. It made no sense. Nothing made any sense. Why would he do this? A strange, unfamiliar feeling bloomed in her chest. It was small and fragile, but it was there, a tiny, flickering ember of something that was not fear. She did not have a name for it yet. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she was not entirely alone in the dark. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into a month. Nothing changed. Every night, Kalen slept on the floor beside her bed. He never complained. He never tried to touch her. He never pushed her for answers she was not ready to give. His patience was a thing of terrifying, beautiful consistency. It unnerved her more than any threat could have. She began to heal. The haunted, starved look in her eyes started to fade. The food he left for her was always plentiful, the fire always lit. He had clothes brought for her, soft tunics and warm leggings that felt like a caress against her skin. She spent her days exploring the vast chamber, which she soon learned were his personal quarters. There was a sitting room with shelves full of books and maps, and a wide stone balcony that overlooked a breathtaking valley, a panorama of snow-dusted pines and jagged, ice-crowned peaks. She never left the rooms. The thought of facing the world outside, of facing his people, was too much to bear. This chamber had become her sanctuary, and he, her silent, watchful guardian. She woke often from nightmares, screaming and thrashing, the ghosts of her past reaching for her in the dark. But every time his voice would be there, a low and steady rumble from the floor beside her. "You are safe, Alara. I am here." He never moved from his spot on the floor, but his presence was a solid anchor in the storm of her terror. She would lie awake, listening to the sound of his breathing until her own heartbeat slowed to match it. One afternoon, she found the courage to speak first. He was cleaning his sword by the fire, the movement of the whetstone a rhythmic, soothing sound. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. He paused, his hands going still. He looked over his shoulder at her. "Why what?" "Why are you doing this?" She gestured vaguely around the room, at the fire, the furs, at him on the floor. "Why are you being kind?" He set the sword and stone aside and turned fully to face her. "Because you are mine," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. The words sent a shiver through her, but it was not entirely fear this time. It was something else, something that resonated with the mark on her wrist. "I don't belong to anyone." "It is not about ownership," he said, his golden eyes intense. "It is a fact of the soul. I have waited centuries for you, little moon. My other half, my mate." Mate. The word struck her like a physical blow. Shifters had mates, she knew that, a fated, unbreakable bond. But that was for them, for powerful alphas and lunas, not for her. "I'm an omega," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "I'm worthless. You've made a mistake." He rose and crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just before her. He did not touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. The air crackled with his power. "There is no mistake," he said, his voice low and fierce. "They lied to you. They starved you and beat you and tried to crush you, but they failed. I do not know what power you hold, what secret lies dormant in your blood, but I feel it. It called to me across a blizzard. It is a fire in the dark. You are no Omega." She stared at him, her heart pounding. Could it be true? Could her entire life, her entire identity, have been a lie? The hope that flared in her was so painful, so terrifying, she immediately tried to extinguish it. Hope was a dangerous thing. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, backing away. He let her go, his expression hardening with a grim resolve. "You will." A second month passed. The routine continued. He slept on the floor. He brought her food. He spoke to her of his lands, of his people, of the long, lonely centuries he had spent ruling them. He told her stories of the stars and the seasons, his voice a low counterpoint to the howling of the wind outside. She, in turn, began to speak to him, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence. She told him nothing of her past, of the abuse. That was a door she could not yet open. But she told him of small things, of a book she had read, of a hawk she saw from the balcony. One evening, a particularly vicious storm raged outside, rattling the shutters. A loud clap of thunder made her jump, a small, startled cry escaping her lips. From the floor, his voice came instantly. "Alara?" She was trembling, her old fears resurfacing. "It's nothing, just the storm." She heard him shift on his pallet of furs. "Come here." The command was soft, but absolute. She hesitated. "Please," he added, and the uncharacteristic vulnerability in his voice was her undoing. She slipped out of the massive bed and padded across the cold floor to where he lay. She knelt beside his pallet, a small, uncertain shape in the darkness. "Sit," he said, his voice a low murmur. He shifted to make room for her on the furs. Heart hammering, she sat down. She was careful not to touch him, but the heat from his body washed over her, a comforting wave. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound their shared breathing and the distant howl of the wind. She felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The fear was still there, a coiled serpent in her gut, but it was sleeping. "You are not what they told you that you were," he said into the darkness. They were blind, afraid of a light they could not comprehend. She wrapped her arms around her knees. "I'm not anything special." "You are," he insisted, his voice raw with a conviction that shook her to the core. "You are everything." Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers hovering just above the back of his hand. She wanted to touch him. She wanted to feel the solid warmth of his skin, to know that he was real, that this strange, impossible sanctuary was real. But she couldn't. The fear was too old, its roots too deep. She snatched her hand back as if burned. A deep sigh escaped him, full of a pain that mirrored her own. "It is all right, little moon. I can wait. I have waited this long. I will wait forever." He did not know how prophetic those words would be. He did not know that their time was already running out. Down in the lower halls of the keep, among a group of refugees from the Silver Moon Pack who had been rescued by Winterfang patrols, jealousy was festering into poison. Lyra had survived. She had been found half frozen but alive and brought to the keep with the others. For weeks, she had been just another survivor, given food and shelter by the grace of the Alpha King. Then she had seen her. She saw Alara, walking on the high battlements with Kaelin. The Omega filth, clad in fine wools, her face no longer gaunt, her hair shining in the winter sun. And the king, the way he looked at her, as if she were a precious treasure. Lyra's world tilted. It was wrong. It was a perversion of the natural order. A worthless, powerless Omega could not be the mate of the Alpha King. It was impossible. Then, one day, she got a closer look. Alara was in the keep's library, a place Kaelin had finally coaxed her into visiting. She reached for a book, and her sleeve slid back, revealing the intricate, shimmering mark on her wrist. The soul bond. Lyra had heard tales of it, the ancient, fated connection. But this was obscene. It was a prize that should have belonged to someone like her, someone of high birth and pure blood, not to the dirt beneath her feet. A venomous, burning hatred filled her. If she could not have that power, that position, then she would see it all burn to the ground. She knew of the enemies of the Winterfang. Whispers of a shadowy faction, the Ember Covenant, led by a usurper who called himself a Shadow King. They sought to overthrow Kaelin. Using a piece of smuggled charcoal and a scrap of parchment, Lyra wrote a message. She found a disgraced merchant heading south and paid him with the last of her jewelry. The message was simple. The Alpha King has found his fated mate. She is a powerless, unmarked Omega from a shamed bloodline. She is his only weakness. Her name is Alara. The message flew south, a poisoned arrow aimed at the heart of Alara's fragile new world. Kaelin had to leave. Reports had come from the eastern border. Raids, strange incursions by warriors who fought with shadow and fear. The Ember Covenant was growing bold. He stood before her in their chamber, dressed for war in black leather and steel. The sight of him made her stomach clench with a new kind of fear. Not for herself, but for him. "I have to go," he said, his voice grim. "It will not be for long. A week, perhaps 2. "Be careful," she whispered, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. He stepped closer, and for the first time, he reached for her without hesitation. He cupped her face in his large, warm hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. She did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "You will be safe here," he said, his voice a low growl. "I have doubled the guard. No one will harm you. I swear it on my life." He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. The contact was electric. The bond between them flared, a warm, humming connection that pulsed from the mark on her wrist to the core of her being. "I will come back to you," he vowed. Then he was gone. The chamber felt vast and empty without him. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was hollow. The spot on the floor where he slept was just a pile of cold furs. For the first time, Alara felt the true depth of her loneliness and realized with a jolt that he had filled a void in her she never knew existed. She waited. 2 days passed, then 3. On the 4th night, the attack came. It was not a frontal assault. There was no alarm, no clash of steel from the battlements. They came like smoke, silent assassins cloaked in shadow. The guards outside her door died without a sound. The heavy oak door to her chamber swung inward. 3 figures stood there, clad in black, their faces hidden by obsidian masks. They moved with an unnatural speed, their blades gleaming in the firelight. Alara screamed, scrambling back. She threw a heavy book at them, then a wooden stool. It was a pathetic defense. One of the assassins lunged. She dodged, her heart seizing with terror. She was cornered. There was nowhere to run. She thought of Kaelin. His name was a silent prayer on her lips. One of them grabbed her arm. His touch was like ice. Another snapped a heavy iron manacle around her wrist, right over the soul bond mark. The world went white with pain. It was not the burning creation of the bond, but its opposite. A cold, deadening severance. The warm hum between her and Kaelin screamed, then went silent. The connection was not gone, but it was muffled, suppressed, a distant echo in a void. The pain was a physical agony, a tearing in her soul. She cried out, collapsing to her knees as the strength left her limbs. The assassins dragged her from the room, her feet scraping against the cold stone. She was weak, helpless. The old feeling of worthlessness washed over her, a suffocating tide. He was wrong. She was nothing. They dragged her through secret passages, out of the keep, and into the biting cold of the night. They threw her onto a horse like a sack of grain and rode hard into the darkness, away from the only safety she had ever known. The journey was a blur of pain and despair. The silver in the manacle seemed to leech the life from her, leaving her cold and disconnected. The ache where the bond had been was a constant, throbbing wound. Could Kaylin feel it? Did he know she was gone? Or did he just feel an empty silence where she used to be? They arrived at a fortress of jagged black rock that seemed to have been clawed out of a mountainside. It was a place of shadow and cold malice. She was dragged to a dungeon, a cell carved from the rock itself and chained to the wall. The chains were also silver. They felt like ice against her skin, sapping her will, her hope. A man appeared at the door of her cell. He was tall and unnervingly handsome, with black hair and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the torchlight. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the predatory smile of a wolf. "Welcome, little light," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I am Morven." The Shadow King, the leader of the Ember Covenant. He entered her cell, circling her like a predator studying its prey. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble," he mused, "but you will be worth it. Kaylin has ruled the North for too long. His power is tied to the land, to the very soul of his dominion, an ancient, tiresome connection." He stopped in front of her, tilting his head. "But a soul bond, that is something else entirely. It is a direct conduit, a vulnerability. I cannot break his connection to his land, but I can poison it. Through you." Fear, stark and absolute, seized her. "What are you going to do?" Morven's smile widened. "Your bond was formed from a spark of life so pure it called to him across a continent, a unique energy. I am going to take that energy. I will invert it, turn it into a blight, and feed it back through your bond. It will sever his connection not just to you, but to his own power. He will be nothing. And then I will kill him." He crouched down, his face inches from hers. "They told me you were an Omega, insignificant. But they were wrong. You are not insignificant. You are a key. The key to my victory." He stood and turned to leave. "Rest," he said mockingly. "The ritual begins in 2 days. I want you at your best." He left her in the crushing darkness, his words echoing in her mind. A key, a tool, a weapon to be used against the only person who had ever shown her kindness. The despair was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She was going to be the death of him. She slumped against the wall, the silver chains biting into her wrists and ankles. She was so alone. The bond was a faint, barely perceptible flicker, a dying ember. She closed her eyes, focusing all of her will, all of her desperation, on that tiny spark. Kaylin. She did not speak the name. She thought it. She bled it into the void. "Kaylin, I'm sorry." For a moment there was nothing, just the cold, the dark, the pain. Then, a whisper, so faint she thought she had imagined it. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a thread of warmth in the suffocating cold. Alara. His voice, distant, strained, but it was him. "Hold on," the voice echoed in her soul. "I feel you. I am coming." The thread of connection was thin, fragile, but it was there. It was enough. Hope, fierce and desperate, ignited in her chest. He was coming. She just had to hold on. 2 days passed in a haze of fear and fragile hope. Morven's guards gave her food and water, a mockery of care. They were fattening a lamb for the slaughter. On the second night, they came for her. They unchained her from the wall, only to bind her hands in front of her with the same silver chains. They led her from the dungeon, up winding stairs, and into a vast cavernous chamber. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something foul and corrupt. A large circular pattern was carved into the floor, glowing with a sickly purple light. In the center stood a black stone altar. Cultists in obsidian masks lined the chamber, their chanting a low, guttural drone that made her skin crawl. Morven stood by the altar, his arms raised, his dark eyes gleaming with triumph. "Bring her," he commanded. The guards forced her forward, pushing her onto the cold stone altar. They chained her wrists and ankles to iron rings embedded in the stone. She lay on her back, staring up at the jagged ceiling, a sacrifice waiting for the knife. "The Alpha King approaches," Morven announced to his followers, his voice ringing with ecstatic victory. "He walks into my trap, blinded by his bond, desperate to save what he thinks is his. He does not know that he is coming to witness his own undoing." The cultists cheered, the sound ravenous and cruel. Morven placed his hands on her forehead and her stomach. His touch was like a parasite, cold and leeching. The purple runes on the floor flared brighter. "Let us begin," he hissed. Pain, unlike anything she had ever felt, erupted from within her. It was a violation, a spiritual evisceration. She felt her energy, her life force, being drawn out of her, twisted and corrupted by the dark magic of the ritual. She screamed, a raw, agonized sound. Through the red haze of her pain, she felt Kalen. He was close, so close. His rage was a palpable thing, a seismic force shaking the very foundations of the mountain. Then, the wall of the chamber exploded inward. Stone and debris flew through the air as Kalen burst into the room. He was not a man anymore. He was a primal force of nature, an avatar of winter's wrath. His eyes were pure blazing silver, and his fangs were elongated. A low growl tore from his chest, a promise of death to all who stood in his path. Behind him, his Winterfang warriors poured into the chamber, their howls mixing with the clash of steel. The battle was immediate, brutal, and absolute. Kalen saw only her. He ignored the cultists flinging themselves at him, cutting them down without a second glance. He carved a bloody path directly toward the altar, his focus absolute. "Kalen!" she cried, her voice breaking. Morven laughed, his hands still draining the life from her. "You see, he is predictable. He cares only for you. And that is why he will fall." As Kalen leapt onto the ritual circle, Morven lifted one hand from her and thrust it toward the Alpha King. A bolt of pure necrotic energy, black as the void, shot from his palm and slammed into Kalen's chest. Kalen staggered, a choked gasp escaping his lips. He looked down at his chest, where the dark magic was spreading like a poison. Then his silver eyes met hers, full of shock and pain. He fell to his knees, then collapsed onto the stone floor, unmoving. "No," Alara whispered. The world went silent. The sounds of battle, the chanting, her own pain, it all faded away. There was only the sight of him, fallen, broken. Something inside her snapped. It was not a gentle break, but a shattering. The grief, the rage, the terror of her entire life, combined with the desperate, ferocious love she felt for the man on the floor, coalesced into a single, incandescent point of pressure. And it erupted. Her scream was not a sound of pain, but of power. A wave of pure, blinding white light exploded from her body. It was the light of a newborn star, the pure, untainted essence of life itself. The silver chains on her wrists and ankles vaporized into dust. The purple runes on the floor were scoured away, leaving clean stone. The cultists closest to the altar were not burned. They were unmade, their dark energy annihilated, turning them into pillars of salt that crumbled into nothing. The light washed over Kalen. The black, necrotic wound on his chest vanished, the healthy skin knitting itself back together instantly. He gasped, his eyes flying open, the silver returning with renewed intensity. Alara sat up. The light still poured from her, a radiant aura that pushed back the shadows of the chamber. She was no longer the frightened girl from the Silver Moon Pack. She was no longer the timid creature hiding in Kalen's chambers. She felt the power thrumming in her, a living, breathing part of her soul. She was whole. She rose from the altar and turned to face Morvan. The Shadow King stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and, for the first time, fear. What are you? They called me Omega, Alara said, and her voice was not her own. It was stronger, resonant with power, clear as a bell and deep as the earth. They called me worthless. They were wrong. She took a step toward him. I am the dawn, she declared, and you have spent too long in the dark. Morvan snarled, gathering shadows around his hands. He hurled them at her, but the darkness dissolved into harmless smoke a foot from her radiant form. She did not falter. She walked through his useless attacks until she stood before him. She looked into his terrified, hate-filled eyes and felt not anger, but a profound pity. She raised her hand, which glowed with a gentle golden light. She did not strike him. She placed her palm flat against his chest. He screamed as her power poured into him. It was not a destructive force. It was a purifying one. It sought out the darkness he had nurtured for centuries, the foul pacts and corrupt magic, and it unwove them. It severed his connection to his shadowy source, leaving him hollowed out, his stolen power draining away like water from a sieve. He collapsed, withering into a pale, powerless man, his youth and strength gone, leaving only a bitter, aged husk. Kalen was on his feet in an instant. He stalked past Alara, his silver eyes cold as a winter grave. He lifted the gasping, powerless Morvan by the throat. "This is for her," he growled. The snap of bone was the last sound Morvan ever heard. Silence descended upon the ruined chamber. The remaining cultists had been cut down by the Winterfang warriors, who now stood watching in stunned, awed silence. They were not looking at their king. They were looking at Alara. The light around her softened, receding back into her until she was just herself again, standing in the center of the destroyed ritual circle. She looked down at her hands, which still held a faint, pearlescent glow. What had happened? What was she? Alara. Kalen's voice was soft, hesitant. He stood before her, his eyes no longer silver but their familiar amber gold, and they were filled with an emotion she had never seen there before. Awe. He reached for her, then stopped, as if afraid to touch her. She closed the distance between them and walked directly into his arms. He flinched, surprised. Then his arms came around her, holding her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his tunic, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and winter and him. For the first time, she was not the one being held for comfort. She was holding him back, her strength a comfort to him. "I thought I lost you," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You found me," she whispered against his chest. You always find me. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. They never saw you, Alara. Not really. But I did. From the very first moment, I saw the fire inside you. I see it now too, she said, a small, wondrous smile touching her lips. They returned to Winterfang Keep not as king and refugee, but as equals, as partners. The journey back was quiet, the unspoken truths hanging in the air between them. Everything had changed. That night, in their chamber, the fire was burning brightly. The room was the same, but she was not. Kaelin stood by the hearth, watching her, his expression uncertain. Alara looked at the massive bed, with its soft furs and pillows. Then she looked at the cold, empty space on the floor beside it. She thought of the months he had spent there, a silent, patient guardian, honoring her fear even when it pained him. She walked over to him, took his large hand in hers, and led him toward the bed. He followed, his eyes searching hers for any sign of fear or hesitation. There was none. She stopped beside the bed and turned to him. No more, she said softly. She gestured from the bed to the floor. No more distance. She climbed onto the bed, her movements sure and graceful. She sat in the middle of the furs and looked at him, her heart open and vulnerable and strong. Ours, she said. The word was a promise, an invitation, an acceptance. A slow smile spread across Kaelin's face, a genuine, breathtaking smile that was like the sun rising after a long winter. He came to her, sitting on the edge of the bed, his weight a comforting presence. Ours, he agreed, his voice thick with reverence. She reached out, taking his hand. She looked at the soul bond mark on her own wrist, the silver and gold swirls that now seemed to shine with an inner light. Then, with a certainty that came from the very core of her being, she placed her other hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She focused her will, not the explosive power of the battle, but the gentle, life-giving warmth she now knew was a part of her. She pushed it through her palm, a gift freely given, a claim freely made. A gasp escaped Kaelin's lips. Through the fabric of his tunic, a light began to glow. He pulled the tunic away, and there, on the skin over his heart, a matching mark was burning itself into existence, a perfect echo of her own, a swirl of silver and gold light. The two marks pulsed in unison, a silent, perfect rhythm. The bond was no longer a one-way street, a fate he had found and she had feared. It was a bridge they had built together, from both sides. It was complete. He looked from the mark on his chest to her face, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Mine, he whispered, the word no longer a possessive claim, but a statement of mutual belonging. Yours, she answered, her voice steady and clear. The next day, Kaelin stood with her on the great stone balcony of the keep, the same one where she had once hidden in fear. Below, the entire population of Winterfang was gathered, their faces turned upward. His warriors, the keep staff, the refugees from her old pack, even Lyra, her face a mask of bitter defeat. Kaelin's arm was a solid, warm weight around her waist. He raised his other hand for silence.
People of the Winterfang!
His voice boomed across the courtyard, imbued with his authority. For centuries, you have known me as your Alpha King. Today, you will know your queen. He turned to her, his gaze soft. This is Alara, not just my fated mate, but your savior. She is the light of the north, the dawn that broke the shadow. he presented her not as a prize he had won, but as a leader in her own right. A wave of cheers erupted from the crowd below, a genuine, heartfelt roar of acceptance and loyalty. Alara looked out at the sea of faces, at the towering snow-capped mountains beyond, and felt Kaylin's hand tighten around hers. The cold was gone. The hunger was gone. The loneliness was gone. She was not a ghost. She was not worthless. She was a queen. She was loved. And for the first time in a life defined by loss and solitude, she was finally, truly home.